and I'm especially happy to introduce our guest today. I don't know if you all know it. We are very lucky here at Villanova that in addition to we have the Wildcat and all sorts of great mascots like that, but we also have our own in-house saint who you've probably guessed he's important to us, St. Augustine, right? You've seen the statues, you've seen the artwork, but it really is nice to know he's actually very important in the world as well. A lot of people have found St. Augustine to be one of the most important thinkers throughout the centuries. And here at Villanova, we're the flagship for Augustinian research and Augustinian scholarship, and it's just very exciting. And so we are fortunate not only to be bringing the wonderful speaker we have today, but also we have the Augustinian Institute and Father Alan Fitzgerald, who's right here. You can stand up and let them see you. Very nice, thank you. Father Alan is in charge of the Augustinian Institute, and through that office we bring scholars from all over the world. So it's exciting, and so you should be very proud that Augustine, he's ours, and that we have kind of bragging rights to him. Today you're going to hear from the Augustinian Fellow who is here through the auspices of the Augustinian Institute, and he is visiting us from the University of Portland. His name is Dr. Michael Cameron. And he's going to be speaking to you today about not only Augustine and Scripture, but also about Augustine the Seeker and how he gets to where he is. So without further ado, and great thanks, Michael, welcome, and come on up, and I'll give you the... and you get to do whatever, that goes on your lapel, and you put that in your pocket, I guess.
Does it sound okay? Good afternoon, thanks for being here. Yes, I'm Michael Cameron. It's an honor for me to stand here in front of you in this place, just for the things that we've just heard, that this is a center, if not the center, of Augustinian study in the world today. And so it's a privilege for me to come and just think about and just sort of stew in the juices of Augustine here over the course of a semester. And I understand that you're being exposed, many of you, for the first time to Augustine, and you may have some questions and a feeling of harumph, why am I having to be here and talk about this guy? Well, I would just like to give you a little bit of a story about myself, about the text, maybe give you along the way too a couple of handles on reading this text, how to read it. But there's a reason it's there in your ACS, more than just that it's an Augustinian university. Augustine's Confessions and Augustine himself are part of the history of the world. He's one of the few ancient thinkers who's still talked about in many different fields like linguistics and political science and history and psychology, not to mention philosophy and theology. This particular book, at any given time, even at this minute, we could go down to a Barnes & Noble and find at least 6, maybe 9 different translations in print of this book. Now, what's all the hubbub about? Our current Pope, Pope Benedict XVI, was asked once, classic question, if you had to be marooned on an island, and you could take a book with you other than the Bible, what's the one book you would take with you? He didn't stop an instant. He said, Augustine's Confessions. The book was important to me too. Actually, it literally changed my life. I teach and I talk about a lot of books. I don't get to say that about many books, but that one I can. And I'll go into that in a minute. But what's the essence and the spirit of Augustine? I'm going to draw something on the Jewish tradition. I love the Jewish tradition for this, and if however many Jewish friends there are out there. I apologize if I dilute the story a little bit, but it's pretty well known that if you ask a rabbi a theological question, you're likely to get a story. Well, here's a story. There was a man named Itzhak, and he lived in Krakow. And he was a poor man, he was a simple man, and he didn't have a lot of money and a few friends. At one point, Itzhak started having a dream. He dreamed about a treasure buried beneath a bridge. And he could see the bridge. He could see the shape of it. He could see the traffic going across it. He could picture it. Well, he passed it off. It's just a dream. Then he has the same dream again the next night and a third night. And this goes on for weeks at a time. He says, what is happening here? I know that bridge. It's in Prague. I must go and see if that treasure is under the bridge. So he makes the long journey from Krakow to Prague. Now, this is in a time when the Jews, as often, are extremely unpopular with the local folk. And he goes down under the bridge, and he's looking and rooting around. He can't find anything, and suddenly there's a policeman behind him and says, "Hey, Jew, what are you doing under that bridge? What are you doing looking around here?" And the man was so shocked, he didn't know what to say except just tell him the truth. "Well, I'm Itzhak, son of Yekel from Prague, and I had this dream a number of times, and I just came here to look for the treasure." And the man said, "You stupid Jew, don't you know there are no treasures under bridges, especially in a busy city like this? Get out of here." And he kicked him and pushed him on. He said, "But I can tell you one thing. I too had a dream." This is the policeman talking. "I too had a dream. I had a dream that there was a man living in the city of Krakow who had a treasure too, hidden behind a stove in his kitchen. But this is a stupid dream. Who listens to dreams? Get out of here, you dumb Jew." Well, Itzhak said to himself, "I live in Krakow. I have a house. I have a kitchen. I have a stove. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to look." And he went all the way back home, hurried, got back home to Krakow, went into his kitchen, pushed back the stove, and lo, there was the treasure in his own house. Okay, did he need to go to Prague? The treasure was in his own house. Why didn't he know it was there? Well, the story goes, as the rabbis would say, the treasure was at home in Krakow, but the knowledge of it was in Prague. And he had to go to Prague to find the treasure. Okay. It's a Jewish story. It's an Augustine story in some ways. It's in a lot of ways that's what the Confessions are about. A man who had the treasure, a treasure of spirit and life and love and wisdom, and went searching for it far, far away in many different bypaths. Ultimately, he found a source of wisdom that brought him back home, and he found it. In some ways, that's my story, too. I grew up in the Midwest, Chicago, Catholic family, went to Catholic grade school, high school, year Catholic university. But I was behind where you are right now. Let me put it that way. I wasn't that great a student. After a year, I dropped out of college and just decided I needed to take a hiatus and figure out what I was doing with the world and myself. Right? Took a job, made some money. Ultimately, a friend and I went from Chicago to the west coast of British Columbia in Canada, looking for a job where I thought I could pay off all, my student loans from my time in college. And well, we got out there, drove the 2,200 miles, and discovered when we got there that, yeah, the job really existed. It was planting trees off the coast of British Columbia. Yeah, the job really existed, but the waiting list for the season was already 2 pages long. There was no way we were going to get this job. I just gone 2,200 miles for nothing. Well, as it turned out, a friend and his brother were on the west coast of the state of Washington, and I could stay with them for a while. Okay. I was free as a bird, didn't have any, real responsibilities outside of those student loans, Went to be with my friend, had extra time, couldn't get on at the shingle mill where they were looking for work. Sometimes, most days, I couldn't get any work. I had a lot of time on my hands. My friend's older brother had some books from his college days. On his shelf was a copy of, lo and behold, Confessions of Augustine. I seem to remember a teacher way back when saying, if you ever get the chance, you ought to read Augustine's Confessions. Okay, you know how this goes. You just try it out. Well, I sat down with this book in the rainforest on the west coast, Pacific Northwest coast of Washington. Raining like it is today most days. And this copy was so old, actually, the thing fell apart in my hands as I turned each page. But as I turned each page, I found a mysterious bond happening with this guy from 1,600 years ago. Let me be upfront about it. I didn't have much background, particularly about the philosophical stuff. I don't know how much you've read. Let me just ask for a moment. How many have gotten into the Confessions yet? Oh, okay, so you've done a little bit. Which books have you read? Just call it out. Which books have you gotten into? 2? The Pear Tree? Okay. What else? Anything else? 3? Okay, so how about like 6, 7, and 8? Those, okay. As I read through it, the philosophical stuff sort of went, I didn't have any stuff, real background for reading that. But one thing that I did pick up on was an intense personality, passionate, full of wonder, full of questioning, anxious to know. Obviously, he knew a lot more than I did, but there was something mysterious that drew me to this man. And so I was able to stick with it. And as we stepped through his life, past the pear tree, past the time in Carthage, past the time with the Manichees, that odd group that he became a part of, past the difficulties with his mother, into the time when he's a professional rhetorician. He goes to Rome, he goes to Milan, and he meets the great famous Ambrose. I found myself working with him and traveling along with him. Ultimately, when I got through book 7, which was a difficult ride because of the philosophical stuff, but still mysteriously attractive, and then into book 8, when you get into the garden at Milan, and suddenly tolle lege, take up and read. When he crossed that threshold, I crossed with him. And something shifted. Now, I could tell the story from the angle of a religious conversion, and in fact it was. I mean, I'd been raised Catholic. I knew a lot of background. I'd, been many years to Mass and so on, but, really was not that aware and interested, and, religion, it was like, that's for that group, here was my own life of faith coming to life right before my eyes. So I can tell it from a religious story angle. I can also tell it from the story of someone simply looking for a center. Now, if Augustine were standing here, he would say, that's exactly what it was. I found my center. I don't think you'll find your really deep center, Augustine would say, unless you find it in God through Jesus Christ, who preaches a wisdom to us and displays a wisdom to us by his self-offering on the cross that's absolutely essential to that. But even people who are inquiring about faith can still see the outlines of something really crucial about a human life. A center, looking for a center. I think of it as a eureka moment. And if I had to title this talk, I would call it Looking for Eureka. How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Reading the Confessions. That would be the subtitle. Looking for Eureka. I think we're all looking for Eureka. Augustine finds his Eureka moment. He narrates it to you. Augustine would look out at all of you and say, you are all searching for Eureka. That Eureka moment, you remember the word Eureka, comes from Greek, means I found it. The great Pythagorean philosopher, was it? He suddenly left me. Not the guy, it's the guy who could move the universe with a fulcrum. His name just left me. Archimedes, thank you. It's not the fulcrum, though. He was working on a mathematical problem and suddenly realized when he stepped into a tub of water that the amount of water that he displaced was equal to the amount of a certain amount that he had been searching for in his mathematical formula, and he realized that he had found something, the solution to a problem, and he ran through the streets of Athens, I guess, naked, yelling, Eureka, Eureka, Eureka. I found it, I found it, I found it. We're all on that path. I think it's an essential element of this book that you've started reading, that Augustine, what's driving him forward in this story is the search for Eureka. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you a few handles on reading this text that over the years, as I've read and reread the Confessions, they've become more and more evident to me as things that stand out that perhaps if I'd had a little bit of help first reading it, it wouldn't have been so difficult. I think there's enough there to hold us, but a few handles could help also. And the way I think of this is in 4 parts. All right, first of all, I'll mention some strategies. That is to say, strategies that Augustine used in writing the Confessions that if you're clued into it, will make it appear more understandable to you. And then the other 3 really break down along the lines of a classic understanding of the human person as made up of mind, will, and emotions. There's an intellectual aspect to the Confessions. There's an emotional aspect to the Confessions. And I think there's what we would call, he would not, but we would call a moral dimension to the Confessions. And I can say also that in line with thinkers about this idea of conversion, like Bernard Lonergan, a great theologian, and other people, even social scientific studies of conversion, have talked about how it's not a momentary thing, it's not just a born-again experience, it's an ongoing transformation of the whole person at each level And I think that's one of the things you get in the Confessions, is this interwoven story of Augustine's conversion intellectually and emotionally and morally. So, in terms of strategies for thinking about the Confessions, you got to realize that even though he's a philosopher and a religious figure, a theologian, at core in his training, Augustine was a speech maker. He was a rhetorician. He talked to people all the time. And he was trained in a very detailed tradition in the ancient world that trained people how to persuade others. He trained lawyers, essentially, for a long, long time. It's what brought him to Milan. Augustine, the rhetorician, is on full display in the Confessions. In other words, the Confessions is a work of rhetoric. That is to say, it has designs upon its audience. He wants to bring you along. That thing of me being carried along with him, that's exactly what Augustine was aiming at, I realized many years later. So he had a couple of strategies, rhetorical strategies, by which to carry us along like that. One of which is the form of it as a prayer. Have you noticed this is not written in the form of an abstract treatise or even a novel, even though it is a narrative? Essentially, it's a prayer to God. Okay, now, think about this. You're sitting in your room, you're doing your homework, and you hear voices out in the hallway, animated voices. Irresistible to listen. What's going on? What's the argument about? What's the passion about? Overhearing has a power to draw us into a conversation. Augustine does not want to be in your face about his journey and his discovery. He wants you to listen on your own terms. He's very willing for you to listen on your own terms. He has his conversation with God that you are invited to drop in on. That leaves you free to be yourself and not have your, kind of defenses up. That's one piece of strategy that I think he's up to. The narrative itself is a piece of strategy. He was very aware of the power of story to bring us along. That's the Jewish connection at the beginning. Augustine, as a lot of us know well, he could write a theological treatise. He can bore your ears off. However, he was also aware of the power of story to catch people up into the emotion and the power of a human life. And his own story, he lays his own story out there as a kind, let's be honest, a kind of performance. He doesn't tell us everything. Yes, it's autobiographical. Don't be mistaken. It's not an autobiography. This is a staged, presented story. He projects himself as the kind of protagonist in the story in order for you to identify with him. He wants you to get caught up in his story so that, as happened to me, when he crosses his threshold or his finishing line or whatever you want to call it, you'll be carried too. Now I say that's rhetorical. He got it from his training as a speech maker, that's true. However, when he became Christian, he read that story or strategy in the design of the Bible. God was a storyteller. That's what the Bible is about. And indeed, the story reaches its climax with the story of Jesus Christ, which is not told as a catechism, it's not told as an abstract treatise, it's told as a story. Jesus is born, he lives, he talks to people, he has disciples, he has conflicts. Ultimately, he's betrayed, condemned, crucified, rises from the dead, and so on. It's a story. I think Augustine took as his model the classic Christian story of the Incarnation, that God comes down to human beings, becomes one of them, gathers followers that he can bring back to the heavens with him. I mean, in essence, that's the Christian story. Those of you who are religious believers, particularly Catholics who go to Mass on Sunday, and when we say the creed, notice the storyline in the creed. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, he was crucified, dead, and was buried. He rose from the dead on the third day. He's going to come again from the heavens. It's a storyline. Augustine could see the power of that story. So anyway, a couple of strategies to be aware of what Augustine is up to. He's got designs on you. All right, in terms of the three parts, the mind, will, emotions. Let's start with the emotions first. I think Augustine fairly summarized as a seeker of happiness. His first philosophically oriented works, he writes some 10 years or so before the Confessions, they're all about this question of what is happiness, how can we be happy? He's not original. This is a burning question in the ancient halls of philosophy, and truth be told, it's really an important question for every human being to this very day. We may have different definitions of happiness. We may have different ideas about how to attain happiness, but we all want to be happy. That sense of not just la-la, not just goofy happy, happy in a deep sense of contentment, fulfillment, enrichment, to be loved, to have all the parts of our inner being in harmony with each other, to be in harmony with the world around us. That kind of happiness, that kind of contentment is what he was after and what we're all after. So in a sense, the search that you find in the Confessions is about that. He seeks it by many pathways, many false pathways. He goes down many dead ends, finds himself in a number of different cul-de-sacs. The frustration, the longing, the inner blame game that goes on in his heart as he finds yet another frustrating relationship or frustrating way of thinking, a waste of time. You probably read he gets fired for philosophy and the love of truth at about age 18, reading the philosopher and orator Cicero. You'll read, if you haven't already, I think it's in book 5, a place where he says to himself, I used to be 18, now I'm 29. I'm asking the same questions, I haven't gotten any answers yet. I've been doing this, I've been doing that, time goes by, the calendars every year get thrown away. Where's it all going? I'm still looking. So he portrays to us. When he finally does reach that threshold, he thinks at first the issue is intellectual. If I can just figure out the right way to think about stuff, I'll achieve that happiness. And he had lots of people around him telling him that was the way. He goes through many different paths on this, ultimately does reach a kind of quasi-satisfying way of looking at the world on the nature of God, the origin of evil, and a few of these other intellectual things that were bugging him. And he actually even catches, through the help of philosophy, he catches a glimpse of the eternal realm. But then he falls back because of the weight, what he says, he calls it the weight of my habits, my ways of being. And he realized it's not just intellectual. It has to do with the way I act. Book 7 is about the intellectual search. And it's very thorough, very rich, very heady. Book 8 is about the moral search. And notice the conversion happens at the end of book 8, not the end of book 7. So this is important. But that's not to take away anything from the intellectual. We shouldn't be siphoned off into pietistic, irrational ways of thinking that think only experience is useful and thinking is not. Augustine would never agree with that. The intellectual search is just as important as the moral and the emotional. And there is one thing that he learned in that intellectual search. And I can confess to all of you also that it freed me up as well when I learned this. Particularly because, as I said, I was not a very good student. So that's the intellectual, at least one dimension of the intellectual in the Confessions. Finally, there's the moral aspect. Talked about the emotional in relation to happiness. Talked about the intellectual in relation to the priority of faith. And we can talk now about the moral in terms of the integration of the heart, the reunification, you could even call it, of the fragmentary nature of life. And I have to say, you guys have it worse than I did. You have it worse than those of us who grew up, say, to take a trivial example, we had 4 television networks we could watch when we were growing up. I mean, there's just no choice in there. How many do you have? 500? 700? At any one moment, the overwhelming number of choices that there are out in the world is banging at your door. And I say you have it worse because what choices require is a sense of a center out of which you're going to choose one thing or another, a sense of value. I'm going to prioritize this over that. Well, why do you? Well, this is quickly presses the issue of wisdom in your life. You've got to get it on quickly. You got to get whatever wisdom is, you got to find it more quickly than I did. Seems to me. And I raised 2 boys. They're in their 20s now, but so I've watched it happen too with them. They're doing good, by the way. So, Augustine couldn't quickly find that center. He went to Carthage. You read about this, right? He goes to Carthage, to the hissing cauldron of Carthage, he calls it. He's about 16 or so. I mean, it's just the snapping turtles of lust are all around him, and he's buried. He's drowning in it. He doesn't know which end is up. Ultimately, he finds a kind of uneasy peace with his inner desires. And there is a strong sexual dimension to his search. I'm sure you've either heard about it or if you haven't gotten into it already. I would hope, however, that you wouldn't just see this in terms of his renunciation, quote unquote, of sex. There's something deeper going on here. It's true, when he finally makes his crossover to conversion, he embraces lady celibacy, lady continence. Masterful rhetorical stroke, by the way, to personify her that way and to have her talk to him in Book 8. Okay, so that is true. But I think it's something very peculiar to Augustine. He did not renounce marriage for everyone. In fact, wrote a wonderful book many years later as a bishop on the good of marriage that actually is one of the most positive and affirming statements to come out of the ancient world about marriage. There's something else going on that I compare to what Jesus did with the rich young ruler. You know this story? The rich young ruler runs up to Jesus and says, "What must I do, Master, to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Well, you know the rules, you know the commandments. Don't lie, don't steal, And the guy says, "Well, I've done all those things." And Jesus says, "You lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and then come follow me." And the man goes away sad because he had many possessions. Okay, simple story out of the Gospels. That actually deeply affected Augustine via the monk Anthony. You'll see this in Book 8. Anthony heard that story and actually sold all he had, became the founder of monasticism. At least that's how he's remembered. Okay, so that's built into Book 8. Well, that's about economics. It has nothing to do with sex. And yet I think the stories are parallel. What I mean is, Jesus comes to people like Anthony or Augustine individually. Yes, he can talk in terms of the commandments, but then he speaks with you face to face. And in fact, actually, even I think he kind of roots around inside your heart. You know, he's moving around, and I picture him doing this with the rich young ruler. He's rooting around inside the guy's heart, and he says, "Oh yeah, I've done everything since I was a kid." And Jesus is moving around and going, "Oh, there it is. Ah, you lack one thing. Go sell all that you have." Now, does that mean everyone is supposed to go sell all they have? No, of course not. Jesus was dealing with this individual. I think he did something similar with Augustine. He's rooting around inside Augustine's heart and says, "Oh, there it is. I want you to renounce this." That's what became the clinching point for Augustine. I think Augustine would say we've all got that point of greatest resistance. And Jesus deals with us to some extent by laws and the scriptures that apply to everyone, but then also deals with us individually. And I'd hope that you would see Augustine in those terms rather than just simply in terms of his renunciation of sex, as if he were simply a sex hater. So, okay, there's a moral dimension in there, there's an intellectual dimension, there's an emotional dimension, there's a rhetorical, strategic dimension, all of which are important. And I suppose I could just summarize by saying it's a personal dimension that's been important to me. And I think of Augustine as my companion. In those many years, it's been quite a long time. In those many years and through many byways, Augustine has been an intellectual, spiritual, moral companion for me. not a master in the sense of ordering everything I do, but someone to constantly be talking with, to reflect with. Someone that I'm journeying with along the way. And that's a wonderful image that he uses himself. He loves the journey image. He loves the pilgrimage idea. We're all on pilgrimage. And I suppose what this talk is about, essentially, in terms of my own personal dimension, is that he becomes an intellectual companion. There's a wonderful statement by a man named Oliver O'Donovan, who is writing a blurb on a book, a reissue of a book by a famous book, very wonderful book, by a man named John Burnaby, called Amor Dei, a study of the religion of St. Augustine. It's about Augustine's view of love. And I'd commend it to you sometime. Never mind the Latin. If you don't have the Latin, that's okay. I think you can get through it. But there's some wonderful stuff in there. Anyway, O'Donovan was saying about Burnaby. He was a Cambridge scholar. He didn't produce that many books, interestingly, but he produced this one marvelous book. And he knew Burnaby. What he said about Burnaby has stuck with me. He said, Burnaby found in Augustine someone whose thought was large enough to devote a lifetime to. And as I stand here before you, I'm that guy. Doesn't mean I only think about Augustine. I got a lot of other things going on too. But as far as a companion, I don't have any other like him. In the next, 10 minutes or so, we're going to get out on time. I wanted to open this up to make it a dialogue, because I've been talking at you. So I wanted to make it a dialogue. If you've got some, issues, if you want to just ask me about my experience, that's perfectly fine too. But if there are some thematic issues about reading the confessions that you'd like to raise, I'd be open to taking them. Anybody? Let me just ask if you've gotten into book 2, you've read about the pear trees. What the heck is up with the pear trees? Don't you feel like, Augustine, get over it. This is just a little thing, Why in the world did he make that such a big deal? Go ahead, Gary.
Just to get the ball rolling, to pick up on your point about sex and the physical world or sensuality, I was trying to explain in my class today, in book 1, why he considers a baby suckling in its mother's breast to be sinful. He says, he talks about the sin of his infancy. He says, what then was my sin at that age? Hard to relate to.
Sure.
Can you take
Excellent. Yeah, excellent thought. And you've all seen this portion? What's it about a baby? How could you possibly condemn a baby? In book 1, just to repeat for the recording, in book 1 he reflects on the self-centered nature of a baby. And it speaks of it in terms of sin. And, this is a little hard to take. Well, let's think about his inner journey having reached this stage. He's in his mid-40s when he's writing the Confessions. And he's looking back over a varied journey in many different directions. The center of which, as I've said, has been finding his center in the God revealed in Jesus Christ. The crucifixion of Jesus has become a crucial piece of data about, not just about salvation, but about humanity. What would have caused the God of the cosmos and the universe to come down into a human being, okay, and not just live the life of a human being, but then undergo this ignominious, excruciating, horrific, humiliating death? From St. Paul, Augustine reasons, in my view of things, he reasons backwards from the moment of salvation and the price for human salvation back to the cause of it. So in other words, if you paid $500,000 for a painting, you can, and there's a charge on your bill and your spouse finds it, well, you got to work your way back to the value of the thing, right? What's the cost? The great cost paid by God for salvation must have been a tremendous problem to pay for. Okay, that to me is the core of Augustine's idea about original sin, which is to say, humanity is in a fix. We're in a hole that makes us so self-absorbed, so intent on our own desire and goal that we will, at our extreme end, slash and kill to get whatever we want. At where most people are, in the middle somewhere, we're just, sort of selfish, with interludes of friendship and companionship and escape from that, because it's not a good place to be. We love to be lovers and so on. Anyway, we are caught in a dilemma. Augustine then looks at the child and sees a kind of budding sinner. Not because he's doing a kind of experiment, but because he's reflecting theologically on the predicament of all of humanity. And so it's true, he's reading the child's actions through the lens of his theological conviction in his mid-40s. And it comes out sounding and looking really stilted. But if you know what he's up to and what he's trying to get to, it may make some sense. Now, you may not agree with it, but it at least makes some sense.
And how would you relate that to sex?
To sex? Well, that ultimately, and he goes to great lengths to try and figure this out, how this self-absorption, how this illness even, let's use the metaphor of illness, how does this illness get passed down? How do we spread it around? Aren't we all just responsible for ourselves? Well, he says, yeah, we're responsible for ourselves, but there's a sense in which social sin is a shared problem. The sin of the world, as the first gospel of John calls it, first chapter of John's gospel calls it, the sin of the world. We're all involved in this. And then there's, ways to think about this in terms of our social predicaments, social sin, social injustice, that we may not have a particular participation in, but nevertheless we sort of participate in passively. So there's a kind of passive sinfulness within humanity, Augustine thinks, that gets passed down. Ultimately, he connects it to sexuality, not sexuality in itself, but sexuality after the transformation of humanity in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve go for their own thing in opposition to God, human nature, it changes. Not fatally, we still have the image of God within us, but we are carriers now of a problematic condition. And that's what he calls, in fact, for the first time in the Confessions in Book 5, he calls it original sin. It's controversial doctrine, but I think it is essential ultimately to understand his overall views. Well, let me open it up, please, to some students. I'd really like to hear from you guys about what you're reading and what's throwing you for a loop. What's your story? Can you identify with this guy at all? Yeah, go ahead.
You said that there's like the prayer.
Yeah.
But like what exactly, like what kind of prayer? Prayers?
What kind of prayer in the Confessions?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for asking that, because one thing that I didn't quite get to is he uses the scriptures as his form of prayer to God. They feed his words back to God in the Confessions. The very first line of the Confessions, "Great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised." It's a psalm of the Old Testament. So it's not a prayer like a set prayer, like the Our Father or the Hail Mary or something like that. It's rather prayer talking to God, as he says, confessing, not just sins, but praise to God, using the scriptures. Again, I think he uses Christ as the incarnation of the Lord as an example here, because the Lord comes down into human flesh to become our Savior. He projects himself in a similar way into us and into the scriptures. He uses scripture in a funny way in the Confessions. He doesn't just quote it, he talks it. You know, he threads it into his own life. They're his words. They are scripture words, but he talks scripture as if they were his own, see? And it's a very deep element of Augustinian spirituality. The biblical words that give voice to this bubbling, gurgling thing of life reaching out toward God. Yeah, wonderful question. What else? Go ahead.
If he condemned the baby for sinning without really realizing it was doing anything wrong,
Sorry, I missed the first part.
if he condemned a baby for sinning without like obviously knowing it was doing anything wrong, does he consider anything against God a sin, even if you don't realize it's a sin?
Would he consider anything,
Like against God a sin, even if you didn't realize you were doing anything wrong?
anything that we do a sin? Would he consider anything we do?
Against God.
Anything we do against God a sin? I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but
If we sin and we don't realize it,
yes.
it's still considered a sin.
Would anything we do be a sin? Well, I think ultimately sin in the definition of personal sin has to be what he would say is volitional. You have to be conscious. The will, the human will, is a crucial element in all of this. That is to say that anything that we do not consciously will can't be a sin on the personal level. At least, you know, in the full throttled sense of it. Now that's leaving aside original sin, which is outside of us in a paradoxical way. But I'd have to say no, not everything is a sin. On the other hand, so we love our friends. That's a good thing, isn't it? How could that be sinful? Well, it's not sinful in itself. But Augustine will point to an example and say, well, you know, pirates love each other too in a lot of ways. You know, they do things for each other. They care for each other so that they can go on their merry way, you know, getting what they want. So the larger project is a sin, but their individual relationship within it is not. You see? So it's a little bit, you know, you got to analyze the subtleties a little bit. But certainly not the case that he is looking at everything that human beings do as sinful. He's looking at God's grace. Really, it's a much more positive thrust at looking at human life than just that. So ultimately, the grand crescendo, and speaking of crescendos, we'll end with this. The grand crescendo of the Confessions is really an outpouring of praise to God using the first chapter of Genesis. That God's overflowing abundance to us should make us aware, as C.S. Lewis said, that we shouldn't be content with little peccadillo things like, taking advantage of each other sexually or going on alcoholic binges and things like that. That's the cheap way of getting joy. Get the real stuff, Augustine would say, which we can find with a life overflowing with God's abundance, such as we can find in the scriptures of Genesis. So, all right, well, I'm going to get you guys on your way on time. So thank you for your time here. I appreciate everything.